The air at the co-op that April morning in 1973 was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, treated seed corn, and the greasy aroma of coffee brewing in the office. It was a smell that meant spring was here, a smell that usually put a man at ease. But not today. Today the air was crackling with something else, the low hum of a brand new engine and the high-pitched whine of envy. Frank Miller had parked his new tractor right by the fuel pumps, angled just so, where no one could miss it. It was an International Harvester 4366, a beast of a machine, all sharp angles and bold red paint. The articulated body, the jewels on all four corners that stood taller than a man, the chrome stack glinting in the morning sun. It was the future, right there on the gravel lot. I was filling a 5-gallon can with gasoline for my old Farmall M, the one I used for odd jobs, when Frank swaggered out of the office, a receipt clutched in his fist. He saw me looking. Of course he did. He'd been waiting for it. "She's something, ain't she, Art?" he boomed, slapping a hand on one of the massive 18.438 tires. The rubber was still black and tacky, the molding nubs not yet worn off. 225 horses at the drawbar, pulled the 24-foot field cultivator yesterday like it was a garden rake. Didn't even break a sweat. I nodded slowly, screwing the cap back on my gas can. "She's a big one, Frank. Brand new, I see." "Straight from the dealer," he said, his chest puffed out. "Signed the papers last week. The bank manager, old Henderson, he says a man's got to spend money to make money. Says expansion is the name of the game now. Corn's pushing $3 a bushel. You can't afford to be small-time anymore." He glanced over at my truck, a '65 Ford F-250 with a few respectable rust patches on the fenders. In the bed sat my greasy toolbox and the gas can. It was a working truck, paid for in cash 10 years ago. Then his eyes drifted down the road toward my place, as if he could see my own iron sitting in the shed. My main tractor was a John Deere 4020, a '68 model, a good, honest tractor. I'd bought it used 5 years back and spent a winter rebuilding the diesel engine from the pan up. It ran like a top, didn't owe me or the bank a dime, and it would pull a 6-bottom plow all day without complaining. But next to Frank's new IH, it was a relic. "Still running that old 4020, Art?" Frank asked, a smirk playing on his lips. It wasn't a real question. He knew exactly what I was running. In a county this small, you knew what your neighbor had for breakfast. "She does the job," I said, my voice level. "Doing the job ain't enough anymore," he shot back, his voice carrying so the other farmers loitering by the door could hear. "You're plowing with 6 bottoms, I'm dissing with 24 feet. I can cover 4 acres for every one of yours. By the time you're done planting, I'll be cultivated and halfway to side dressing. That's the difference between getting by and getting ahead." He wasn't wrong about the math. His machine was a marvel of modern engineering. Power shift transmission, air-conditioned cab with a radio, hydraulic flow that could run an entire space program. My 4020 had the optional canopy to keep the sun off, and the only music was the steady rhythm of the 6-cylinder engine and the whine of the synchro-range transmission. "The bank's loaning money at 7%, Frank continued, pressing his advantage. "It's practically free money, Art. You're leaving a fortune on the table by pinching pennies. You could trade that Deere in, get yourself a new 4430, maybe finance a bigger planter. You gotta grow." I looked him square in the eye. Frank was a decent enough fellow, but he'd gotten a taste of easy credit, and it had turned him into a preacher for the First National Bank of Polk County. "What I have is paid for, Frank. The land my grandpa homesteaded, the house my dad built, and the iron in my shed. When I put a crop in the ground, the only man I owe is myself. I sleep pretty good at night." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You can't eat pride, Art, and you sure can't pay your bills with it. You'll see. In 5 years, guys like me will be buying up guys like you for pennies on the dollar." He slapped the big tire again, a gesture of finality, and climbed up the ladder into the plush cab of his new tractor. The diesel engine roared to life with a clean, powerful sound, a world away from the puff of black smoke my old Deere gave on a cold morning. He gave a little wave, more of a dismissal than a greeting, and rumbled out of the lot, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of money in his wake. The other farmers watched him go, a mix of awe and jealousy on their faces. One of them, Old man Hemmings, shook his head and looked at me. He might be right, Art. Times are changing. I just picked up my gas can and headed for my truck. Maybe they are, I said, more to myself than to him. But debt is still debt, and a tractor's only worth what it can earn after the payments are made. I drove home with Frank's words echoing in my head. Was I a fool? A dinosaur, clinging to the old ways while the world moved on. My dad's voice was always in the back of my mind, a steady baritone from years past. Never borrow for what you can't pay back in one good year, son. Never bet the farm, because the bank don't care about your blood and sweat. They just care about the numbers on a page. It was a lesson from the 30s, a ghost story told around the dinner table, a warning etched into the family Bible. But this was the 70s. The experts on the radio, the men at the bank, the articles in Farm Journal, they all said Dad's thinking was obsolete. Leverage, they called it. Efficiency, economies of scale. Before we go any further into this story, before I tell you about the long nights in the shop and the whispers at the feed store, I have to ask you folks a question. Have you ever had to stand your ground like that when everyone around you, from your neighbors to the so-called experts, is telling you you're a fool? When the whole world seems to be running a race in one direction and your gut is telling you to stand still or even walk the other way? Let me know your story down in the comments below. It's a lonely feeling, and I reckon more of us have been there than we'd care to admit. That spring was a wet one. The rain came down in sheets, turning the black dirt of Polk County into a thick, greasy gumbo. It was the kind of spring that tested a man's patience and his equipment. For Frank Miller, the mud was just an inconvenience. His big, articulated 4366, with its four-wheel drive and immense weight, floated over the soft spots. From my kitchen window, I could see him out there, day after day, his disc blades throwing up great wings of dark earth, the lights on his cab cutting through the grey twilight as he worked long past sundown. He was a machine, and he had a machine to match his ambition. For me, it was a different story. The 4020, for all its heart, was a two-wheel drive tractor. The 18.434 rear tires, even with fluid and wheel weights, would slick over with mud and lose their bite. I spent more time getting stuck than I did turning soil. One afternoon I was trying to finish the last 10 acres of the north field, a piece of ground that was notoriously wet. The tractor was laboring, the engine groaning as the wheels spun, digging themselves deeper. I tried to ease up on the clutch, to rock it back and forth, but it was no use. She was buried to the axle. I shut her down and sat there for a long moment, the sudden silence broken only by the patter of a light drizzle on the metal canopy. The smell of hot diesel and wet earth filled the air. I looked over the long green hood of my tractor, the paint faded from years of sun, a few dings and scratches telling the story of its working life. In the distance, on the next section over, I could see the unmistakable shape of Frank's IH moving steadily, relentlessly across his field. He was making progress. I was making ruts. There was nothing for it. I climbed down into the mud, my boots sinking nearly to my ankles. The walk back to the farmstead was long and humbling. Every farmer knows that walk, the walk of defeat when the iron has failed you. Back at the shop, I fired up the old Farmall M, my little utility tractor. It was a 1951 model with a narrow front end and a sputtering four-cylinder gas engine, but it was nimble. I hooked a long log chain to its drawbar and drove it back out to the field. It took me the better part of 2 hours. Hooking the chain, pulling until the M's little tires spun, shutting it down, repositioning, and trying again. The chain was caked in mud, my hands were raw, and a cold seep of rain was working its way down the collar of my jacket. Finally, with a great sucking sound, the 4020 lurched free from the mud's grip. By the time I got it back to the shed, it was nearly dark. I was soaked, exhausted, and my mood was as foul as the weather. As I was scraping the thickest mud off the tires with a spade, a set of headlights swept into my yard. It was Frank. He rolled down the window of his shiny new Ford pickup. "Heard you were having some trouble," he said, a little too cheerfully. "Saw the M heading out to the north field. Figured you'd buried the deer." "Got her out," I grunted, not looking at him. "You know, Art," he said, leaning his arm on the windowsill, For what you're losing in downtime, you could be making a payment on a new 4x4. That thing of mine, it'd walk right through that mud. Wouldn't even know it was there. I finally stopped and looked at him, my patience worn as thin as the tread on the M's front tires. I'm not losing anything, Frank. It's just my time. And my time is my own. It's not the bank's. He just shook his head, that same pitying smirk on his face. Suit yourself, but you can't fight progress. You'll be planting corn in June at this rate. He put the truck in gear and drove off, leaving me alone in the dim light of the barn with my muddy tractor and my stubborn pride. The rest of that planting season was a battle. A seal on one of the hydraulic cylinders for the three-point hitch started weeping, forcing me to top off the fluid every morning. I spent a whole Saturday tearing it down, driving the 20 miles into town for a new seal kit, and carefully reassembling it, my hands covered in hydraulic oil. The injector pump developed a stutter at low RPMs. Instead of buying a rebuilt one for a few $100s, I spent 2 nights in the shop with the service manual spread open on the workbench, carefully disassembling the pump, cleaning each tiny spring and valve with diesel fuel, and putting it all back together with the precision of a watchmaker. It was tedious, greasy work, but when I bolted it back on the engine and it fired up, running smoother than it had in years, the satisfaction was immense. It was a feeling Frank Miller, with his warranty and his dealer service plan, would never know. The talk at the coffee shop didn't help. I'd walk in for a cup in the morning and the conversation would quiet down. I knew what they were saying. Old Art Jensen, trying to farm like it's 1950. Too stubborn to get with the times. Frank Miller picked up another 80 acres south of town. Here he's buying a bigger combine now too. I was becoming a local curiosity, a relic. Even my wife, Martha, who always stood by me, had a worried look in her eyes. "Are you sure we're doing the right thing, Art?" she'd ask quietly at night. "The Millers just put in a new kitchen. Their kids have new clothes for school." "We're doing fine, honey," I'd tell her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We're building on rock, not on sand." But some nights, lying in the dark, listening to the wind whistle around the old farmhouse, I wondered if I was just building myself into a corner. The years from 1973 to about 1978 were what they later called the golden age of agriculture. The grain sales to the Soviet Union had opened the floodgates. Prices for corn and soybeans shot to the moon and stayed there. Land values doubled, then tripled. The banks, flush with cash, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The official line from the Secretary of Agriculture himself was plant fensero to fensero, and Frank Miller took that advice to heart. He became the king of Polk County. Every time a piece of land came up for sale, Frank was there with a cashier's check from the bank. He bought the old Hemmings place when the old man retired. He bought the Peterson farm after a family squabble forced a sale. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, all prime black dirt. His equipment lineup looked like a dealer's showroom. The 4366 was traded in for a brand new, top-of-the-line Steiger Panther, a green monster with over 300 horsepower. He had 2 new International Harvester 1486 tractors for planting and cultivating, and a massive 715 combine with an 8-row corn head. His success was loud and visible. He built a new, bigger house on a hill overlooking his land. He put up 2 giant Morton machine sheds and a grain leg with a row of shiny steel bins that towered over the landscape. He and his wife took a vacation to Hawaii. He was the embodiment of the new American farmer, aggressive, expansive, and deeply, deeply in debt. And everyone, from the banker to the boys at the co-op, saw him as a genius. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. My operation didn't change much. I was still farming the same 320 acres my family had always farmed. The high grain prices were good to me, no doubt about it. But I used the extra money differently. I paid off my operating loan from the year before by July instead of December. I put a new steel roof on the barn and sided the house. I started a college fund for my 2 boys. I built up a cushion, a cash reserve in a savings account that earned a modest 5%. In the eyes of the community, I was stagnating, treading water, a man afraid to take a risk when the getting was good. Frank would see me at the parts store and shake his head. "Still tinkering with that old junk, Art. I heard you were trying to patch a radiator on that 4020 last week." For God's sake, man, life's too short. A new tractor doesn't leak. He was right about the radiator. It had sprung a pinhole leak along one of the seams. I'd spent an afternoon draining it, cleaning the spot with a wire brush, and carefully soldering it shut. It was a $2 fix that cost me 4 hours of my time. A new radiator would have been $400. To Frank, my time was worthless. To me, that $400 was another brick in the foundation. It was during this time, in the fall of '77, that I found it. I was at a farm auction over in the next county, looking for a used hay rake. The sale was mostly junk, the sad remnants of a farm that had gone under. Tucked away behind a collapsing barn, half swallowed by weeds and burdock, was the frame of a tractor. It was huge, articulated like Frank's, but it was a ghost. The paint was almost completely gone, replaced by a deep, uniform coat of rust. The tires were cracked and flat, the cab glass was shattered, and a family of raccoons had made a home in the engine compartment. It was an early model Versatile, one of the first 4x4s they ever built. A D100, I figured, from the mid-60s. It had a Cummins diesel engine, or what was left of it. The auctioneer could barely get a bid. It was too big to be practical for most, and too far gone to be worth fixing for the rest. "Who'll give me $50 for the old scraper?" the auctioneer hollered. "Good heavy iron here, boys." Frank Miller was there, of course, looking to pick up another grain wagon. He saw me looking at the rusted hulk and chuckled. "What are you going to do with that, Art? Plant it and hope a new one grows?" Something inside me clicked. Maybe it was his condescending tone, maybe it was the challenge. Or maybe I just saw the good bones underneath all that rust. I saw a simple, brutally strong machine built before computers and fancy electronics. It was all heavy steel and straightforward mechanics. My kind of machine. I raised my hand. $100, I said. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I got 100. Who'll give 110? Frank just laughed out loud. No one else bid. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, pointing his gavel at me, "to the man with more time than sense. It took me 2 days and a lot of work with a cutting torch and a heavy-duty winch to get it onto a lowboy trailer and haul it home. I backed it into the corner of my shop, and it sat there like a sleeping giant. It was my project. Martha thought I'd lost my mind. The boys at the coffee shop made jokes about Art's folly. Frank told everyone I was building a monument to stubbornness. I didn't care. I had a plan. I worked on it during the winter nights after the chores were done. I pressure-washed decades of grime off the frame. I pulled the engine, a big inline-6 Cummins, and mounted it on a stand. It was seized solid. I spent weeks soaking the cylinders with penetrating oil, patiently working the flywheel back and forth with a 6-foot breaker bar, until one night, with a groan of protesting metal, it broke free. While the rest of the county was caught up in the boom, I was in my shop, covered in grease, rebuilding that old engine, relining the brakes, rewiring the electrical system. I was taking the profits from the good years and turning them not into payments, but into solid paid-for iron. As the decade began to turn, a few whispers started to surface, like the first cold breeze of autumn. A news report on the radio mentioned something called the prime rate. It had ticked up to 9%, then 10%. The banker, Mr. Henderson, dismissed it when I saw him in town. "Just the Fed trying to cool down a little inflation, Art," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "It'll come back down. Don't you worry. Now, are you sure I can't interest you in a loan to pick up that quarter section next to you? The owner's looking to sell." I told him I wasn't interested. That night, I stood at the edge of my yard, looking across the section line. The lights were on in Frank Miller's new house, a beacon of prosperity on the hill. In his massive machine shed, his fleet of new red iron sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, each machine trailing an invisible chain of debt that stretched all the way back to the bank in town. Then I looked back at my own shop. In the dim light, I could see the silhouette of the old Versatile, its frame now painted a practical John Deere green, the rebuilt Cummins engine waiting to be lowered back into place. It was ugly, old, and an object of ridicule, but it was mine. And as the wind picked up, carrying the first real chill of the coming winter, I had a feeling that owning things outright was about to become very important. The party was still going strong, but I could hear the music starting to fade. The summer of 1979 came in hot and stayed that way. The sky over Polk County turned a pale, hazy blue and forgot how to make rain. The corn, which had shot up tall and proud in the wet spring, began to show the strain. By mid-July, the broad green leaves were curling in on themselves by midday, trying to hold on to what little moisture they had. The ground cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. At the co-op, the old-timers looked at the sky and shook their heads, their faces grim. It was the kind of summer that could break a man who was stretched too thin. Frank Miller was stretched thinner than anyone. He was farming so much ground that he was constantly running, a frantic pace set by the ticking clock of his loan payments. His big Steiger Panther ran from dawn until well after dusk, pulling a massive 32-foot disc chisel to break up the hardpan soil. The dust it raised was a permanent cloud on the horizon, a tan plume that marked his progress and his desperation. One afternoon, I was out in my own north field, cultivating my soybeans with the 40-20. The work was slow, the heat shimmering off the tractor's green hood in waves. I had the 4-row cultivator set just right, the sweep slicing through the crusty soil, plucking out the velvet leaf and water hemp without disturbing the bean roots. It was quiet work, just the steady thrum of the engine and the scrape of steel on dirt. That's when I saw the cloud of dust on Frank's land stop moving. It just hung there for a long time, then slowly began to settle. A bad sign. Later that evening, I drove into town for a hydraulic fitting and saw the dealer's service truck heading out toward Frank's place. The next morning at the coffee shop, the story was all over. The turbocharger on the Steiger's big Caterpillar engine had seized up. A catastrophic failure. "Melted down like a candle," said one of the guys who'd heard it from the mechanic. "Gonna need a whole new turbo, new lines, probably scored the pistons. The dealer's gotta order the parts from Peoria. Frank's down for a week, maybe more." "What's a repair like that run?" someone asked. "Mechanic figured north of $5,000, parts and labor," came the reply. A low whistle went around the room. In 1979, $5,000 was more than I paid for my used 40-20. Frank was a ghost for that week. When the Steiger was finally running again, he pushed it even harder, trying to make up for lost time. But the drought had already done its damage. His corn, planted thick to chase those record yields, had suffered the most. The stalks were spindly, the ears small and poorly filled out. My own crop, planted at a more modest population, had weathered the dry spell better. My roots went deeper, and they didn't have to fight as many neighbors for a drink. That fall, the other shoe dropped. On the radio, the news was full of rising tensions with the Soviet Union over their invasion of Afghanistan. Then came the announcement that would echo through every sale barn and coffee shop in the heartland: a U.S. grain embargo. The market, which had already been softening, collapsed overnight. Corn that had been flirting with $3 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch $2. The first cracks in Frank Miller's empire began to show. He'd borrowed against the promise of high prices, and that promise had been broken. He had payments to make on 1,000 acres of overpriced land and a fleet of machinery that was depreciating faster than a car driven off a cliff. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted defensive look. He stopped coming to the coffee shop. He'd pull up to the fuel pumps at the co-op, fill his tanks without a word, and leave. The talk wasn't of his success anymore. It was hushed speculation about how much he owed the bank. Through all of this, my winter project was coming together. The old versatile D100 no longer looked like a rusted relic. It was painted a clean, functional John Deere green. Not for looks, but because I had a few gallons of it left over from painting the hay rake. I'd finished rebuilding the big Cummins diesel, replacing the sleeves, pistons, rings, and bearings. Each part was cleaned, measured with a micrometer, and assembled with care. I'd recored the radiator myself, a tedious job of soldering in new tubes. I bought 4 used 18.4-34 tires from a salvage yard and bolted them onto the big steel wheels. The cab was still rough. The glass was a patchwork of plexiglass I'd cut myself, but it was enclosed. On a cold Saturday in November, with my sons watching from a safe distance, I connected the batteries, checked the fluids one last time, and climbed into the cab. I hit the starter button. The big engine turned over slowly, groaning, then coughed once, twice, belching a cloud of black smoke that had been sleeping in its cylinders for a decade. And then, with a deep, rumbling roar that shook the walls of the shop, it caught. It was alive. The steady, low-idling thrum of that Cummins was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of 100 late nights, of greasy hands and busted knuckles. It was the sound of self-reliance. It was the sound of a machine that owed no man a single dime. The year 1980 dawned cold and bleak, not just in the weather, but in the hearts of farmers across the Midwest. The news from the Federal Reserve was grim. To combat runaway inflation, the chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, had cranked up interest rates. The prime rate, the number that banks based all their loans on, began a relentless, terrifying climb. It hit 12%, then 15%. By the time farmers were looking for operating loans for spring planting, it was pushing 18%. 18% interest was a death sentence. It meant that for every dollar a man borrowed for seed, fuel, and fertilizer, he'd have to pay back $1.18. With corn prices hovering just over $2, the math simply didn't work. Panic began to set in. The friendly smiles at the First National Bank of Polk County were replaced with tight-lipped anxiety. Mr. Henderson, the manager who had encouraged Frank to expand, was suddenly reassigned to a branch in the city. His replacement was a young man in a crisp suit who didn't know the difference between a combine and a cultivator. He didn't care about your family's history on the land, he cared about a document called a balance sheet. Frank Miller was the first to fall, and he fell hard. His variable rate loans, which had seemed so smart in the 70s, were now a guillotine. The interest payments on his land and equipment ballooned to an impossible figure. He couldn't get an operating loan for the new crop year. The bank said he was overextended. He was land-rich and cash-poor, a common farmer's ailment that had just become terminal. The notices started appearing in the county newspaper, tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse. Sheriff's sale, by order of the First National Bank, the property of Frank and Carol Miller. It listed it all in cold legal language, the 1,000 acres, described by section and township, the house on the hill, the 2 Morton sheds, the grain bins, and a separate auction for the farm equipment. The day of his equipment auction was grey and cold, a bitter March wind whipping across the yard. Nearly every farmer in the county was there, not to gloat, but to bear witness, a silent, grim-faced congregation at a funeral for a man's dream. The auctioneer's fast-talking chant sounded obscene in the heavy silence. The nearly new Steiger Panther, the one that had cost Frank over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $40,000 to an out-of-state buyer. The big red combines, the tractors, the planters, they all went for 50-40 cents on the dollar. The bank's man stood by a pickup truck, a clipboard in his hand, tallying the losses. I saw Frank standing by himself near the back of one of his empty machine sheds. He looked a decade older, his face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. He was watching the machinery he had been so proud of, the symbols of his ambition being loaded onto strangers' trailers and hauled away down the gravel road. He wasn't the king of Polk County anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything. My own situation was starkly different. I had no debt. The money I had saved during the good years became my operating capital. I didn't have to go to the bank, hat in hand, to beg for a loan at 18%. I bought my seed and fertilizer with cash, writing a check from an account that was earning interest, not costing it. When spring fieldwork began, my farm was one of the few that came to life with a sense of quiet purpose rather than frantic fear. The old Versatile proved its worth 100 times over. It wasn't pretty and it sure wasn't comfortable, but it was a brute. I'd bought a used 24-foot field cultivator, the same size as Frank's old one, at another distress sale for a song. The Versatile pulled it without even breathing hard. The 4-wheel drive traction and the sheer weight of the machine allowed me to work the ground efficiently, covering in one pass what used to take me 2 or 3 with the 40-20. I was doing the same work as Frank's big Steiger, but my fuel bill was my only expense. There was no $5,000 a month payment hanging over my head. The old John Deere 40-20 was still my primary planting tractor, reliable as the sunrise. The Farmall M still did the light work. My fleet was old, paid for, and I knew every bolt and seal on each one. When something broke, my workshop became my dealership. A breakdown cost me time and a few dollars for parts, not a week of downtime and a bill that could choke a horse. I was surviving. More than that, I was secure. My foundation, built on rock, was holding firm, while the castles built on the sand of easy credit crumbled all around me. The day the bank auctioned off Frank's land, I was there. It wasn't out of some morbid curiosity. I went with a purpose. The auction was held on the courthouse steps, a cold, formal affair. The crowd was mostly strangers, investors from the city, corporate farm representatives in clean boots. They were circling like vultures, ready to pick the bones. The auctioneer started with the 80-acre parcel that contained the house, the sheds, and the bins. The home place, the heart of the Miller farm for 2 generations before Frank. The bidding was brisk at first, but it was all the outside money. I saw Frank and his wife Carol standing off to the side, huddled together against the wind, watching their life being dismantled piece by piece. Carol was crying silently, her face buried in Frank's shoulder. When the bidding stalled, I stepped forward. My voice was steady when I called out my number. A murmur went through the crowd. I was a local. I wasn't supposed to have this kind of money, but the cash I'd so carefully saved, the money I hadn't spent on new iron, was sitting in a cashier's check in my coat pocket. The man from the investment firm looked at me, annoyed, and raised the bid. I raised him back. We went back and forth, the price climbing higher than I was comfortable with. I was bidding on more than just land. I was bidding on a family's dignity. Finally, the investor shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the quiet town square. Sold to Art Jensen. I didn't buy any more of his land. The corporations got the rest of it, vast anonymous tracts that would soon be farmed by hired men who didn't know the history of the soil they were tilling. But I had the home place. That afternoon, I found Frank loading the last of his family's personal belongings into a U-Haul truck. The house on the hill was empty. He didn't look up as I approached. "What do you want, Art?" he asked, his voice rough. "Come to gloat? To say you told me so?" "No, Frank," I said quietly. "I came to make you an offer." He finally stopped and looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. "I'm not a landlord," I told him. "I don't want to run this place. I bought it so it wouldn't be sold to some stranger who'd tear the house down for a tax write-off. I want to rent it back to you, the house, the sheds, for whatever you think is fair. $100 a month, whatever you can manage. You can stay here. Keep your roots down." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He didn't understand. He had treated me with condescension for years, mocking my old equipment, calling me a fool. He was expecting a kick. I was offering a hand. "Why?" he finally whispered. "After everything, why would you do that?" "Because we're neighbors, Frank," I said, "and this whole mess, it's not your fault alone. The bankers, the experts on the radio, they sold everyone a bill of goods. You just believed it more than most. No one deserves to lose their home." Tears welled up in his eyes, the first I had ever seen from him. He tried to speak, but he couldn't. He just nodded, a deep, shuddering nod of a man who had been thrown a lifeline when he was sure he was going to drown. That single moment was my vindication. It wasn't about being right about the money or the machines. It was about proving my father's other lesson, that a man's true worth isn't in what he owns, but in his character when times get tough. Life in Polk County found a new, harder kind of normal after that. Frank took a job driving a truck for the co-op. It was humbling work for a man who had once been the biggest operator in the county, but he did it with a quiet dignity. He and Carol stayed in their house. On weekends, I'd sometimes see him out in the machine shed, tinkering on an old pickup. We never talked much about the past, but a quiet understanding passed between us. The smirks and the arrogance were gone, replaced by a deep, weary respect. The community changed too. The talk at the coffee shop was no longer about who had the newest, biggest machine. It was about who could find a used part to keep an old one running. It was about helping a neighbor finish his harvest when his combine broke down. My ways, once seen as eccentric and backward, were now viewed as wisdom. Younger farmers, the ones who had managed to hang on, would stop by my shop. They wouldn't ask for a loan, they'd ask for advice. How do you rebuild a water pump? How do you set the timing on an old diesel? I'd wipe the grease from my hands, pour them a cup of coffee from my thermos, and show them. My two boys grew up with grease under their fingernails. They learned to weld before they learned to drive. They understood the difference between a purchase and a payment. One of their first lessons was on the old Versatile. I remember my oldest son, David, about 16 at the time, sitting in the cab with me as we pulled the field cultivator. "Dad," he asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the Cummins, "why don't we have a new tractor, like the ones you see in the magazines, with a quiet cab and a radio?" I throttled the engine down and looked at him. I pointed to the faded green hood, to the simple steel levers that controlled the hydraulics, to the big, honest gauges that told you everything you needed to know about the engine's health. "Everything you see here," I told him, "we own. It belongs to us, not the bank. This engine's roar, that's the sound of freedom. The quiet cab, the radio, that's the sound of a payment book. There's a big difference. One lets you sleep at night." He nodded slowly, understanding. It was a lesson he never forgot. Years later, I'm an old man now. My hands are gnarled and stained with the memory of 1,000 repairs. David runs the farm, and he runs it the way I taught him. The old John Deere 4020, now over 50 years old, is still here. It's semi-retired, used mostly for mowing roadsides and raking hay, but it starts every time. And the Versatile Art's Folly still sits in the main shed. It doesn't do the heavy tillage anymore. David bought a newer, more efficient machine for that, paid for with cash after 3 good years. But every spring, he fires it up and takes one ceremonial pass across the field nearest the house. A tribute. Sometimes, in the evening, I walk out to the edge of the yard and look out over the land. I see the original 320 acres my grandpa broke with a team of horses. I see the 80 acres next door, where Frank's grandkids are now playing in the yard of the house he never had to leave. The lights are on, a warm glow against the twilight. I don't see a rusty old tractor or a faded green one. I see a legacy. I see a life built not on the shifting sands of credit and ambition, but on the solid rock of hard work, thrift, and the simple, profound wisdom of owning what you have and having what you own. The music of the boom years has long since faded, and the silence that followed was deafening for many. But here, on this piece of ground, there is a quiet, steady rhythm. It's the rhythm of a well-maintained engine, of a crop coming in, of a farm that endured. And it's the sweetest music I know,